Hello everybody and welcome to this week's Marshall Hangout. This week we have 2006 Marshall scholar Dan Wheats to speak to us on a subject which I think is very current and one I know that he's been thinking about for a long time, having followed him on his various blogs and thoughts. And so I'm really excited to hear what he has to say, and I'm sure we will all learn a great deal. So Dan, let me hand it over to you.
There we go, finding the mute button. Good morning, afternoon, evening, friends. Really nice to gather here. Thank you, Mary, for this opportunity to share one of our Marshall Hangouts. I wish we could be together in person, but this is a lot better than nothing. I've enjoyed getting to tune into some of these, although not as many as I wish, but grateful that they're on the Marshall website to catch up on after, which I've done a bit of. And yeah, I really appreciate when Mary first reached out about putting out the call for more participants or presenters in these Hangouts. I thought, sure, I'll be glad to talk about climate action and clean energy. That's my day job. And, like I'm sure the rest of you, the thing you're doing each day, you can talk about in your sleep, and very, very happy doing so. So that was my initial idea. But then as I was kind of reflecting on it a bit more, I just felt a bit of an urge to do something a little more personal. Although I'm not seeing classmates of mine who I got to know really well at Oxford or elsewhere in the UK. I think we're part of a community with a lot of shared values, and it's personally very meaningful to get to reflect on and kind of journey on these particularly salient for me and my family questions around racism and white supremacy. So decided to take a little pivot and appreciate you being game to listen in and maybe join a bit of the conversation after my opening presentation. This is a journey, as I'll share a little bit when I get some slides going here, that I've been on for the last decade and a half or so in a pretty conscious way. And as I'll share in some not so conscious ways prior to that. And so, yeah, it's just meaningful for me to get to join with you and share some of what I've been learning. Just as a quick disclaimer, the little kiddos that I'll be referring to are not very far from me. My dear wife is on mom duty right now, but you may hear them in the background, like probably most or all of you. I'm still working from home these days. And the other little disclaimer is that maybe this goes without saying, but talking about this stuff can feel a bit raggedy, if you will. I always get some things wrong, but I really do believe in trying and encouraging more of these types of conversations. So I thank you in advance for your grace. The last disclaimer I'll say, and then I'll just shut up and get going, is like I'm sure all of you, it's a busy season of life, a lot going on the work front. So this is going to be not the most scripted presentation. I've got some slides here which will guide the way, but thanks for kind of letting me talk from the heart. So without further ado, let me share my screen. And of course, I would welcome folks interrupting with questions as I go along. And otherwise, I'll be sure to leave plenty of time at the end for some real discussion. And as Mary said, if folks are feeling inclined to maybe be a little more personal, we can simply ask her to stop the recording, and I would welcome that. So I've titled this, as you saw, Unlearning White Supremacy, Lessons from My Kids. And as you see there, I was an 06 scholar, went up to Oxford in 06, did a 2-year MPhil in political theory. Most amazing experience imaginable, including even meeting my wife there, who was up on the roads from South Africa. So I just couldn't be more grateful for the whole Marshall experience, and to get to continue in this community with you is special. So part one of this, just going to take the title in 2 chunks, is the white supremacy part, and I bolded the learning white supremacy piece of this because I'm going to try to unpack in the first several minutes here a process that is very much still a work in progress of gaining eyes to see the white supremacy that I would say has been part of my story and my upbringing, even though the wonderful parents and family who raised me had no such intentions going along. And I shared a couple of images here on this title slide because I actually want us to kind of acknowledge that this may well for you, as it is for me, be what you think of when you hear those uncomfortable words, white supremacy. In the upper right there, this is, so I'm in Nashua, New Hampshire, should have mentioned that. And Nashua City Hall, this was about 2 months ago. We had a small group of self-proclaimed neo-Nazis parade out front of City Hall one evening with this banner that you see. And so chances are, like me, you probably think of neo-Nazis, folks like that, when you hear the words white supremacy. Or the middle photo there is about half an hour from our home, one of the towns, rural towns not too far away from our small city, where still this image I took a little before the election, but I actually drove by a few weeks ago, and the same 4 flags are up there. And you can see, of course, the Confederate flag flying. And then the bottom image is from about a year ago, some of the early protests after the murder of George Floyd. This was at our state capitol in Concord, New Hampshire, and a striking image. I didn't take this picture, but a friend did, of some kind of self-proclaimed protectors, fully armed conservative men there, in this case, fist bumping with a white police officer while African-American state trooper has his back turned. So this, again, is probably a bit more of what we think of when we hear the words white supremacy, but I want to be very intentional about asking us to kind of acknowledge and put these sorts of images to the side. And instead, I'm going to go back and share a bit of my journey here, kind of with a couple of questions as we move along. The first one being abolitionists or enslavers? So the image, I'm sure you guys recognize this famous painting in the upper right. This is from the so-called First Thanksgiving back in, was it 1621? Within that first year after the Pilgrims arrived on the Mayflower there at Plymouth Rock. And you see a beautiful image of a beautiful woman serving, white European woman serving some nice food to the friendly native visitors, their guests, it would seem, who have made themselves comfortable and are receiving the gracious hospitality. And you can kind of fill out the rest of the scene. And this is just a crop of the larger image, which is well worth studying. And I share this because every Thanksgiving, as long as I can remember, we'd have our nice family meal. And once we had finished the turkey and whatnot, we would sit out, and my grandpa would pull out the old book by William Bradford, the first governor of the Plymouth colony, and we would read, different people would read different years, the account by Bradford of that first Thanksgiving. And I can remember a lot of details of that story. And I don't remember when I first saw this particular image, but this perfectly encapsulates what I was kind of taught to feel and know about that arrival. My family proudly traces our first American ancestors to the Mayflower, and others to that first generation in New Hampshire. And the image below is something we proudly remember as the Weeks Brick House. It still stands in Greenland, New Hampshire, right outside of the port city of Portsmouth, considered to be the first native brick house in New England. And this is a kind of monument. It was built in around 1710 by the son of our first Weeks ancestor, who came over from England. And this was all part of a story that I learned as a young guy, of how my folks, our people, the Weekses, were on the right side of history. And in those early days, yes, there was some unfortunate stuff that happened with first contact with the Native Americans. And yes, as I learned in high school, a lot of the Native peoples died. And actually, there were a lot of settlements here. So the numbers were a lot bigger than I'd initially been led to believe in terms of the number of people who died. But mostly it was disease that was unfortunate. Yes, there was some conflict. But the overarching narrative was about our people having come in search of freedom, and building good lives and a good future here. And when it came to actually confronting enslavement, we were on the right side of history. We were the enslavers. We fought from the Revolutionary War through the Civil War on the northern side for freedom to end this terrible enslavement. What I've only uncovered in the last year is that while I don't know for a fact, there is a pretty good chance that some of my New Hampshire forebears and Boston forebears participated in enslavement, possibly directly, certainly indirectly. So the fellow Samuel Weeks, who built this house that you see around 1710, was a mill owner. He was a selectman in Portsmouth, a prominent member of the community. And in accounts, historical accounts that I've been reading, particularly in the last year, I've learned that it was very commonplace in New Hampshire and throughout New England for people of that upper set to own other human beings. I've learned that 2 generations before New Hampshire became incorporated as an independent colony toward the end of the 1600s, in 1645, the first enslaved person was brought from Guinea to Portsmouth. His enslaver was punished by the Puritan authorities, not for owning another human being, but for working his human chattel on the Sabbath. And what a relearning that has been to question that initial core identity of who my particular family is. And so I've got a lot more studying to do, but knowing that that we're just not nearly as innocent as I imagined, both when it came to contact with the native peoples, whom we effectively helped to exterminate, but also when it came to actually enslaving people. And we know that now in New Hampshire that more than 1,000 African people were enslaved, with the last records of enslavement going to as late as 1840 and 1858, just a couple years before the Civil War, being the final date when enslavement was made illegal in New Hampshire. The second here gets a little more directly to my nuclear family and the identity with which I was raised, again, pretty much unconsciously. But I can't tell you the number of times that someone would throw out this phrase "lily white" as New Hampshire, we're lily white. Never stopped to think about it. The fact that white has been so often consciously and unconsciously equated with purity, perfection, cleanliness. And that to even describe New Hampshire as lily white was factually very inaccurate. Yes, we are one of the least ethnically diverse states in the country, but in numerical terms, that still meant that even when I was a kid, there were somewhere around 50,000 people of non-European descent in New Hampshire. And nowadays that number is about 150,000. And yet the town I grew up in with about 1,000 people, Temple, New Hampshire, was, as far as I could tell, 100% people of European descent. My family certainly fit the bill, a lot of blonde hair and blue eyes and red like me. And my high school, pretty similar story as well. I first encountered difference. I mean, I should say even before getting to this slide that all those years growing up until I was 18 and most of the time in rural New Hampshire, I didn't know a single person of non-European descent. And as a consequence, every friend, every role model, principals, coaches, what have you, reinforced quietly that identity. And needless to say, what I've just shared about New Hampshire's history of enslavement, that was never taught to me in school either. Even my AP history course had precious little to say about the phrase has been used by one of the tremendous New Hampshire African-American authors that shadows fall north as well, but no hint of that all those 18 years. I then took a gap year before college. So I went to public high school in New Hampshire and got to do my undergrad at Yale, but in between I spent a year in DC. And I could spend the whole time here just reflecting on how that kind of rocked my world, moving from so-called lily white New Hampshire to a city that is roughly 2/3 folks of non-European descent, the very large African-American population. But I'll share just one tiny anecdote. One of these students you see, so I was with AmeriCorps, spending most of my time as a teacher assistant in McFarland Middle School on the Georgia Ave Petworth part of DC. A couple blocks across the line, I was told I should not cross by the wealthier family members who lived in DC, who just, as far as they were concerned, you just don't go there. But I was one of maybe 3 or 4 folks of European descent working in this school for this year. And on 2 separate occasions, a young girl, middle school girl, just sort of looked into my face and with this sort of bemused smile said, "You have blue eyes." And years later, would I read Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye and start to kind of reinterpret that. And I don't want to ascribe too much meaning to that. And yet it was one of a number of instances in which I was confronting difference and certainly feeling different, but in which the definitions of those different identities had a clear ranked value. I've since become very persuaded by Isabel Wilkerson's use of the term caste to describe not just the Indian caste system as we call it, but the American system as it was devised. And it was a clear demonstration, seen in retrospect, that there was the qualities that they saw in me were qualities to be desired, qualities that conferred superiority, conferred benefits. And just to mention 1 or 2 other aspects, lessons from that year, I remember distinctly in our first year, I was part of a team of roughly 10 AmeriCorps members. About half of us came from DC, were African American. The other half were from various states, mostly European descent. And as part of getting to know our new city in that first week, we were sent, our whole team, to visit different neighborhoods. And we showed up in Georgetown on this particular day. And I couldn't have felt more at home. I'm not from DC, but it was great, beautiful. Many of you have been there. Seeing the discomfort and the lack of security that my colleagues felt on my team who had spent their entire lives in DC. In fact, some of them had never even left the district, never had an opportunity to travel, but just going, 10 blocks from where they had lived much of their lives to this neighborhood of Georgetown and feeling, being profiled, being followed around in the shops. We went into a couple of places, feeling just grossly uncomfortable was another shocker for me, one of many that year. So there was a beginning awareness of difference, but then to kind of move forward in time, this is a phrase that struck me, and it was the title of a piece I wrote back in, I think, 2012, before we had kids, but a couple of years into our relationship with my marriage with my wife, Cindy. So here, I was struck. We were living in Cape Town at the time, and we had gone to see a play by the famous South African playwright Athol Fugard. And it's a play about an South African principal at a township school who finds himself in a relationship with a white librarian of European descent in the community. And I won't get too lost in that, but it helped me to awaken to the fact that as I was entering this relationship, so a few years before seeing this play, and even before introducing Cindy to my family, just, whenever I went home, grandma especially would ask me about my relational, what was going on, and had I met the special one, and so on. And I found myself defaulting to, they'd ask her name, and well, Sindiso isn't a name they'd ever heard before. Ta-Nehisi. The question didn't even need to be asked in words, but I felt it had to be answered. And what I found myself doing is using a kind of, as if a disclaimer to say, well, yes, she's African, but no, she's not what you think, or what even I would think, which is someone who needs to be rescued by an American, a white American, someone who is just kind of, trying to hitch a ride, God forbid, but she's a PhD, she's a Rhodes Scholar. And so this kind of qualifying that I engaged in, not so consciously at the time, is painful to look back on, but a realization that, when speaking with family, even, getting those comments, well, she sounds very impressive, but think about the kids, could you really actually marry such a person? Could you really start a family? So this kind of continued process, and then kind of moving forward, I should pick up the pace a little bit so we can have some discussion at the end, but an acculturation process. We love this quote from one of Trevor Noah's early skits. We like to say we knew him before everybody else got to see him in South Africa when he was a kind of local comedian there. And this quote here, Sinisa just totally lit up when she heard it, because this was about the same time before we were actually married, when I was trying to introduce her to my New Hampshire life. And of course, that meant a lot of time on mountains and whatnot. And she was very game. And yet, as we came to get to know each other better, and she could be more open with me, it was clear that, you know, she didn't have any burning desire to risk her life on mountains. This was our first trip together, actually, to the Swiss Alps on one of those vacations between terms at Oxford. And as it happens, you know, that picture is kind of ironic, because I ended that day being airlifted off of the mountain, my first and hopefully last skiing accident, and she was stranded. That was a story for another day. But what she had experienced growing up in Soweto, literally scenes like this, with members of her family killed by the South African nationalist troops and the patrols, and her parents literally hiding her in the back of the car so they could get her out of the township to get her into the first class of an integrated school in the good part of town. Just made me realize it was one of many opportunities to realize that the status quo I had been taught wasn't neutral. And boy, was there just so much more complexity to what I assumed were the good ways to be. And so taking kind of the next step toward integration, my people, your people. And, you know, I look at these two scenes, and the scene above are members from a local village where her family comes from. These aren't her actual relatives. But we spent some time traveling through Mpumalanga province in South Africa on one of our early trips. And this is my clan here in New Hampshire. And just, I think even at that time, I would look at a group like this and think and process, interpret something very different from what I would interpret looking at not just my own kin, but a like group of people. And you know, there were moments in these years where we'd be driving into Boston, and I would find myself, you know, parking in a different part of town. And as I left the car and saw an African-American man walk down the street, literally worry, well, is the car safe? And should I go back? And on one occasion, I did go back and check if I had locked, kind of realizing this, all of these biases built in. And, you know, ironically enough, members of my wonderful family have done some bad things, have struggled with drug abuse and all the rest. Rates we know to be the same across racial groups. And yet, I think even at that time, my assumption and the safety with which I would inhabit the one space or the other was just very different. So finally, and then I want to get into the lessons. We were married on three times actually to conform to her Swati culture, but the white wedding, as it is literally called, umshado in her native Zulu language, took place on a wine farm outside of Cape Town, and we were married here under the slave bell, as it was called. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but for those who've read Kendi, he talks a lot about the assimilationist trend and how there has been through the arc of American history a clear sense that the way for African Americans to be at least somewhat permitted to occupy this land is for them to assimilate into the dominant European culture, and certainly such were the trappings of our wedding there, ironically enough, under the slave bell. And yet, such is not the solution. Assimilationism is not the path. I'm convinced anti-racism is. So finally here, married our kids the day she became a citizen here, while maintaining her South African citizenship. And even in this time, an American citizen, a PhD, she was hearing on the streets of New Hampshire the N-word, or go back to where you belong. So part two, I just want to kind of pull from this reflection a couple of 5 lessons. And I'm going to try to move through these a little more quickly so we can have some time for conversation. So again, using some quotes or expressions that we've encountered along the way. This one just hit me to the core when I first heard it from Ta-Nehisi Coates. Race is the child of racism, not the father. For those who've had the occasion to read Coates, to read Kendi, or the many other remarkable African-American writers, or African writers who have been helping to educate our world. I'm on an anti-racist reader project this year, reading only books by authors of African descent, and boy, is it opening new worlds for me. But how poorly and I think many folks of European descent were, and not just of European descent, Americans of all backgrounds, how poorly we were educated. Only recently, with the publication of the completion of the mapping of the human genome, could we certifiably say that there is no genetic difference. We're more than 99% genetically the same. In fact, more genetic variation within so-called racial groups than between so-called races. And I purposely try to either not use the word race or put it in quotation marks, because it is a biological fiction, and yet, of course, a profound social reality. And so if we can see the way in which the idea of race was born, literally commission, the King of Portugal, King Henry, commissioning a scribe to tell the story of how his uncle had begun the trade of enslaved people, glorifying that process, coming up with the idea of Blackness, which would then be incorporated more deeply and deeply by successive generations of pseudoscientists trying to organize humanity into different groups. The number varied. Sometimes it was 5, 3, 6 different so-called races, pure pseudoscience for centuries, to create this narrative of difference, which of course is the basis of different valuation. And yet today, our kids born in 2016, our twins, and then our little guy a few years later, the hospital here in Lily White, New Hampshire, just went right ahead and assigned them the designation African American. Because if you go back to our own history and the slave codes of Virginia in 1705 and beyond, it was very clear as a matter of policy that in order to protect this free workforce of people, human beings owned by other human beings, the one drop rule would apply, and you had to be pure or else you were subjugated. So number 2, racist is an adjective, not a noun. Whenever I have these conversations, and we've had many with family, many uncomfortable ones, to be honest, and with friends, there is such a natural and understandable tendency to say, I'm not a racist. And I believe that you do not want to be a racist. I don't want to be a racist. And yet I can't deny the fact that when I, as millions of other people, took the Harvard Implicit Association test, I registered, even years after marrying my amazing wife, I registered anti-Black bias, pro-white bias, as do the vast majority of Americans and other people who take that test. And so urging that we think of racist as not a fixed descriptor, those bad people, the neo-Nazis there at Nashua City Hall, those are the racists, everybody else is innocent, but as an adjective which describes all of us some of the time, none of us all of the time, and which, if we can accept and abide in that discomfort, I love those words of Emerson, people wish to be settled, only insofar as they are unsettled is there any hope for them. Only when we are unsettled can we change. So if we can accept that racist describes some of what I think involuntarily, probably, some of what I do subconsciously, then can we begin to diagnose and move through it. All right, number 3. There's no such thing as a microaggression. We've all heard the expression microaggression, and I kind of assume that, well, there's lynchings, God forbid. And On a side note, we had an attempted lynching in New Hampshire about 5 years ago, another story. But we think of those as distant past, a century and more ago. But then there are all those really small things when people are just a little bit insensitive. And I kind of accepted that dichotomy until rather recently, as my wife and through our kids have helped me to see that, one African-American boy after another, assumed to be a man, assumed to be dangerous, shot by police. Where does that begin? And can we call it micro if it carries with it the psychic burden and weight of wondering when it will turn on a dime to being fatal? So a neighbor here in our neighborhood, we picked the most diverse community we could find in New Hampshire. But most of the folks on our street are also of European descent. And one of our neighbors just commented very innocently, "Watch out for that guy," referring to our, at that time, 3, maybe 4-year-old son. "He's trouble." And she knows him, and I think she likes him. I think she'd watch out for him if she saw something going amiss. But what if her sister was visiting from out of town and saw our little boy, maybe he's not 3 anymore, but 9 or 11, and assumes he can't be from here, assumes he's doing something wrong, calls the police? What could happen then? And even if statistically the odds are very small, for my wife in particular, and increasingly for me, it's impossible to treat it casually. And remarkable research, if you've had a chance, if you haven't had a chance, I recommend Googling the term weathering and looking at how folks of African descent in the US have a much higher disease burden, have a maternal mortality rate 3 times that of mothers of European descent. And when you control for all the standard factors of socioeconomic status, the rates are still vastly differential. And the conclusion is that living in a racist society as a person of a lower caste robs you of physical health and shortens your lifespan, not to mention environmental racism and all the external factors that directly contribute as well. So I think we need to move beyond the idea that there are microaggressions and to see just how violent even the possibility when a person lives with the fear that their son or daughter or they themselves are at risk. When my wife walks down a street and doesn't know if that person yelling that obscenity would actually stop the truck and actually do something. When she walks into a room or onto an airplane and can only see people of European descent, and rationally she says the odds are really good, she's going to be safe, and yet can't help thinking, what if they do something to me? That's a real burden. Number 4, and then the last one. So often we hear the phrase, "I don't see color," or "I voted for Obama." It's not me. Kind of going back to that point in terms of racist is a noun describing other people and could never be used to describe me. I think folks like me of European descent need to see that it's just not about us. And its intentions are good, but intentions must be separated from actual harm, actual impact. And so often we see real harm being done. This is our local pool here in Nashua, and I thought of this image because I highly recommend, among the great books I've been reading this year, is the new one out from called The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, former president of Demos. And she uses the metaphor of the public pool, where thousands of these pools across the country, south and north, were literally filled in when desegregation was finally ordered after Brown v. Board of Education, and how we robbed all of us of public goods that had benefited the entire community, not to mention the psychic cost of living in continually segregated communities, even if it's now de facto rather than de jure. So we've got to see that intentions aren't enough. I don't see color, this colorblind ideal. It's just not going to cut it. And we've got to go systemic, move from the individual to the systemic reforms. Which brings me to this final point. Yeah, we want to be allies. And that's a good place to start by all means. But I would submit that being not racist isn't actually not racist, because we've got a system structured in a racist manner. Systemic racism is oh so real. My latest kind of writing has been on the modern day manifestations of systemic racism in New England and in New Hampshire, and how vastly unequal we are. Pick your domain, from health to education to incarceration, to economic opportunity. And so to be not racist, to just be an ally. Our neighborhood lit up with Black Lives Matter signs after George Floyd's murder. They've now pretty much all gone away. Our neighborhood is, as you walk a couple blocks north, and it's the fancy north end of town, and there's scarcely a family of color there. You go to the town where our next town over, where our kids go to Montessori school before we'll transition into the public schools, and zoning ordinances mean that every home there has to have a couple of acres. So scarcely any chance that families of color will move in. To just be not racist and just say Black Lives Matter without penetrating the systems, changing those zoning ordinances, changing the way we pay for public education, changing our criminal justice policies, as we've started doing in this country, but have a long way to go. That's not going to cut it. Which brings me to this final thought and this metaphor. So we talk about hand in hand. This was a wonderful graphic that emerged after the events of last year. But what if we looked beyond? And you may have heard this, to me, just incredibly moving anecdote. So a couple of days after that, Dylan Roof shot up that church in Charleston, South Carolina, the tragic killing at Emmanuel AME Church. A brave young woman of African descent, Bree Newsome, determined that she was going to scale the flagpole at the state capitol and finally take down that Confederate flag. She did that with some training and support. The police showed up as predicted, and they were literally poised to tase the flagpole, which, according to Dr. Bettina Love, who tells the story, would have almost certainly resulted in Bree's death. She would have fallen 30, 40 feet as the pole was turned into electrocuted. A guy of European descent like me, James Tyson, was there as more than an ally, ready to put his hand on the pole as a co-conspirator. And he did that. He put his hand on the pole, and the police backed off, and Bree could come down safely. And finally the flag was taken down. So I've taken more than my due, but thank you so much for listening, and I'd love to hear any thoughts or questions in these last 20 odd minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. If people would like to say something or ask a question, if you just stick your name in the chat, we will call on you.
Stop the screen share.
I think Dan is, oh, there you go, Jamie.
Sorry, you can go, Mary, if you want.
No, you go.
I just really appreciate your talk, Dan, and everything you've been sharing. And we've been going through a similar process. I'm actually a professional historian, and I didn't even know about redlining till like 5 years ago. I'm a British historian, but still. And so I've been reading a lot of the same books. Our church is doing a book group on caste by Isabel Wilkerson. We've been reading Coates and others. And I feel on the one hand, this kind of, it's not really about me, but what can I do situation, right? But some things that I've been thinking about is, in one way, one of the only ways I can in any way wrap my head at all around the idea of what it would be like to be an African-American person in the US, and the kind of daily weathering and daunting. And it's not equivalent, and I don't mean to make it equivalent, but it reminds me of during the Me Too movement, these conversations I would have with my husband, where he would say, well, people are talking about catcalling, and that's not the same as rape, right? And this reminded me of your talk about microaggression versus real aggression, right? And it's like, no, but if you live in an environment where every single day you walk by a group of men who catcall you, and you're not sure if it's going to become violent or aggressive or infuriating, it creates a situation in which one starts thinking about these things constantly, right? And then it's on a spectrum with sexual harassment on work, sexual assault, like all of these things. And so I know it's not the same, and that I, at the same time, as a white woman, I carry other privileges or protections, if you will, around me. It at least has helped me imagine the kind of exhaustion and fear and process that can happen over a lifetime of living in the United States. And I'm also very grateful. I have a colleague at work whose office is next to mine. He's our African-American historian, and he's African-American. We have very similar backgrounds in a way. We're both from an evangelical context, so we have a lot of cultural markers. But, you know, every time there's another shooting or another thing, he just says to me, you know, I don't even want to bring up, and he just says, it's just exhausting being Black in America. My wife and I are exhausted. And so anyway, I think that you're speaking, and those of us who are not African-American, we do need to step up and talk to our own people, because my Black friends tell me they're exhausted talking about it, and we need to talk to each other. So I don't know if any of those are helpful, but I just wanted to share those reflections, and thank you for talking to us about it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jamie, and such a joy to see you. One of my good friends and 06 classmates. Yeah, just to key off ever so briefly on that last point, I'm convinced that that is a part of my calling, and I commend it to my brothers and sisters of European descent. There's good evidence to show, not just anecdotal, that other folks of European descent are much more likely to listen and take on board these kinds of questions when coming from people who share their cultural background than when coming. I mean, how often has my wife experienced the phenomenon of being considered the angry Black woman and discounted as a result? So I think, you know, my job is to be silent when it comes to when there are opportunities to listen and learn from folks of African descent who have the calling and passion and energy and resources to speak up to society as a whole. Better yet, I think to buy and read their books and gift their books and all the rest. But within our own community, if we don't, it sure ain't going to change. And one stat that I do like to come back to, well, two, we're at a status quo today where the average child of European descent is born with 10 times the family resources of the average child of African descent. And we are on a path to close that gap in 228 years. And that will not be accelerated if folks like us, if I may say, don't dig in and do the work and speak this truth to our community.
Grace.
Hey, hi. Hey, Mary. Hey, Daniel. Thanks so much for sharing your story so thoughtfully. I resonated with a lot of what you said and really appreciate you sharing your perspective so bravely. My question was about your decision to live in New Hampshire together. Yeah, what was that decision like between you and your family?
That's a great one, Grace. As Jamie may know this, but one of my, I'll call it my dirty secrets, is that since I was a teenager, I come from an old family with a long tradition of public service or politics. And people have, I guess, flattered me to say that it's something I should do. And I've taken that on board, and I've got plenty of pride and ambition to go with it. And so it has been something kind of on my mind and heart for a long time, coming back to New Hampshire, where we have these long roots and trying to serve in public office. Without getting too kind of far off, one thing that Cindy made crystal clear to me when we started getting serious was that she never aspired to be a politician's wife. She never imagined living in New Hampshire. And so if that was what I needed as a sort of condition, she was not the right one for me. And I'd say the good Lord did a lot of work on my heart, teaching me to hold that particular passion loosely and to move to South Africa for a time as we did. And so much of this conversation I need to thank that experience of living in South Africa. Certainly didn't do that justice here today. But she was extremely gracious. Took me probably 7 years of tender prodding and lobbying to agree to settle down here. So we're here for a while. We'll be back in South Africa eventually.
So Dan, you mentioned your reading group where you're reading only Black authors. I'd be interested to hear some of the books that you've read, which ones you thought were, you know, what were your favorites and for what reasons? I think that would be a really interesting, helpful thing for people to hear, because again, knowing about authors is some of the battle to actually finding the books. You know, we've heard of the ones that everybody's heard of, but perhaps some of the ones that we haven't would be really great to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. Gosh, it's been just such an exciting year of opening up new worlds. Perhaps some of you can relate, but my previous default was American history written by guys who look like me. And I love the biographies. I've done all the presidents and all that stuff. And so I realized, just again, status quo ain't neutral. I'm so conditioned to read a certain kind of book. And so by kind of setting these guardrails and saying for at least a year, I did a little math. I think I've read somewhere over 1,000 books by authors of European descent, and literally a few dozen, if that, books by authors of African descent. So I had a lot of catching up to do. And beyond some of the well-known Times bestsellers. So I just finished Twisted by Emma Dabiri, which focuses on hair, but boy, she goes so far beyond that. We've been thinking a lot about hair lately. You know, I had a moment cutting our son's hair. My daughter was kind of helping me out there in the bathroom, and just right out of nowhere, she said she doesn't like her hair, and that her hair is bad hair, and that her teacher's hair and her classmates' hair is good hair. And that kind of stopped me in my tracks. She was 4 years old. I compliment her like crazy because I so want to, you know, somehow compensate for the society, but getting to understand just how deep that goes. But even if there's nobody in your life who has so-called Black hair, level 4 hair, there's so much in this book. She's recovering. She's of Nigerian descent, and questioning notions of time and how, so I'm focused here on racism, but another, Jamie sort of raised notions of intersectionality, gender being a huge factor in this. My wife and I now have shorthand, we call it IMPI, which is our shorthand for this, this conglomeration of imperialism, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, and how they actually are part of a whole. And so Dabiri in this book questions capitalist notions of time, the imposition of wage labor and all that, and how pre-colonial hair was a remarkable element of cultural expression. And the fact that it could take a whole day to do one's African hair in the way that that it is uniquely called for meant manifold opportunities for community building and relational building and living a richer life than a by the clock kind of capitalist life. So that's one, Twisted, that I love. I mentioned Heather McGhee's The Sum of Us. It's recently been getting a lot of traction, but such, I think, one of the best pieces of kind of political economic analysis with ultimately a positive message. She's making the case for how we can solve some of the intractable problems by seeing she calls it the solidarity dividend that we will realize. And she goes kind of big issue after big issue to show how we can benefit everybody by overcoming these issues. Reading While Black, Jamie and I kind of share an evangelical background. Amazing book by Esau McCauley. I'm also thinking of Jamar Tisby. So many good ones. I'll just mention one other for the more kind of analytical types. This was one of the first I read last year as I was kind of getting more serious. From Here to Equality. If you're a political economist or anything like that and want to really look at the question, really deeply at the question of reparations, which I'm convinced when we talk about structural reform, I think there's nothing more important than actual meaningful with a dollar value reparations. To cut that 228 years down to something that's somewhat morally acceptable. And that's just an incredibly robust account. I mean, he provides documentation for the more than 50,000 people of African Americans who were murdered between Reconstruction and the end of the 19th century, just in that period of time. I mean, talk about terrorism. So, you know, although I was years into my kind of education, he took me so much deeper in terms of the actual depth of the sin that has been perpetrated and its modern day applications, which I think argue that much more strongly for the kind of structural reform that reparations would represent.
Thanks, Dan. That's great. I've written them all down. I shall be on to my local bookshop to see if I can get some of them. Has anybody else got any questions? You don't have to have questions. I think it's been a really interesting conversation. Well, I think if no one else has anything, I will say thank you. Thank you, Dan, for talking us through in such an honest way your journey, and making yourself vulnerable in some ways to be able to talk about those things, because it's not the easiest thing to talk about, and something that we all have to learn to start talking about. So thank you very much for that. I really appreciate it, and thank you so much for volunteering. I'm sad we didn't get to see the kids, but we did hear them, so they're definitely there. So thank you very much, Dan. Thank you everybody for coming, and I look forward to seeing you at future Marshall Hangouts.
Thank you so much, guys. Really good to connect. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Dan.